talking about family dynamics, there were points in time where I was thinking about aspects of what is really happening between individuals when communication is taking place. Like, what are the ways to get our hands on it? Like, define this problem in a way, or not necessarily problem, but define this phenomena in a way that we can really wrap our heads around everything that's taking place when people are trying to communicate around difficult or other issues. And you and I have talked in the past about this communication model, thinking about sender variables and receiver variables and all that they add to this, rich interaction of human dialogue and family dynamics. And I'm wondering if you could run us through this model.
Yeah, this is one of the great communication models out there. To be fair, there are lots. And in some ways, we're agnostic. We want you to find the one that does. But they all really come from these studies that say really only about 7% of what's said is retained, and also that people who don't feel heard are bad listeners. And so we're really battling those two things right out of the gate. And as we were talking about in the webinar, people mentioned this idea of like, oh, being logical versus emotions. But unfortunately, there are emotions. So the more that we fight that, and that's really that undertone there, we try to have these fact fights, but they're actually feelings fights, right? Maybe you interrupted me. That's a fact, but I felt disrespected. That's the feeling we're actually talking about, because usually we're not just describing the behavior. So there's an emotional layer that really then has a layer of trust. Do I feel comfortable with you having this conversation too? And so we can build those two things by behaving well in these conversations. We can also erode those two things by behaving well in those conversations. So there's first what I want to say, right? If I'm communicating to Donnel and it's coded by how I grew up, right? My own experiences. And I love to say that in a very simple way. We do something called equivocate. We change the name of definitions without knowing it. We change it by region and things like that. And so I say fine to park because I see a sign that says fine to park. Donnell's a smart guy. He knows that means they're going to charge me money. Then I say that work is fine, but I'm really grumpy about it. And that's how we change those things. And then there's our experience with the topic, right? If I feel nervous about money, maybe I don't want to ask my parents for a raise, I'm going to maybe stammer. I'm going to maybe feel nervous. And then there's a background with that. So again, Donnell's my dad, and I feel uncomfortable asking for a raise, and he always says no to me no matter what. And so I'm really adding all these layers into what's going on. Some are verbal, some are nonverbal, some are in pattern. And what we tend to do when we're nervous, we speak really fast and our voices raise and we get really high. And it's very easy for that to go awry. What happens then is Donnell has this receiver side that has just as many filters as I just described. So imagine I'm his kid. He's used to me being a little impertinent. He's used to me being a little big for my britches, all of these things. So even if I did my best to speak really carefully, cautiously, and I put together my first business plan that a really great person helped me work on, he may still hear it as something else. Donna, what would you as a receiver hear it like, probably?
Yeah, it's these perceptions of like all of a sudden you have like, what does this person actually think of me? Do they respect me? Do they care about me? Are they looking out for their best interests, or is this just another example of them vying for their own desires? And it really kind of it muddies the water a little bit in terms of what's being received.
Absolutely. I had this happen just 2 weeks ago today, not today, 2 weeks ago, where there was a mother-daughter combination. So that idea that daughter had worked really hard, she'd talked to her next gen group, all of these things, and she put together this great business plan asking for a pay rise. And the receiver variable, what mom heard is, when I brought you in this business, you didn't have this educational background. I've already accelerated you pretty quickly. And it's never enough. No matter what I do is never enough. And because she was triggered, right, her background experience of the topic, the mother, she came back with, well, I don't even know what you're doing all day. Like, I don't even see you in the office, which is a fair point. This young woman doesn't really come to the office. It doesn't mean she's not working. And that young woman, instead of trying to describe how she's much more facile with technology and she works in other places, she's like, you're not always around me, right? That breakdown of our different life experiences and how we describe them and how we respond to feedback from them, they were just eroding that trust. And both of their emotions were getting higher and higher and higher as they were having this conversation.
Yeah, it leads me back to something that I've heard said a few times and I've certainly seen it when I've been interacting with clients is you can have a conversation with a group of family owners who all grew up in the same household. And this conversation may be about what was it like to grow up in your house? What were the relations like? And it would almost seem as if they grew up in five different homes. And it's really kind of demonstrates how you may have the sender variables of like what the parents were trying to convey and the way that they parented and how they had intentions for a certain way of the family to interact and what was important to them. But the way that it gets received, it goes through that individual filter that is based on what makes a person unique as a human being, and gets colored. And it's not always complimentary.
It's not always complimentary, and we tend to do it in a really not helpful way. And that's what this young woman did. And that's what a lot of people do. We've all heard of the sandwich compliment. That's what she did. She's like, Mom, I love working. She did all those wonderful things. And Mom was like, oh, we're about to have a hug. And then she then says, you're not paying me enough, because she'd worked herself up into it. So it's like hugging you and sucker punching you at the same time. And so when we force that oppositional aspect, a way that this young woman could have done it with the same business plan in a different way is say, Mom, I'm so grateful to be here. I love this organization, and I'm really looking for a pathway for progression. I think that's what you want for me too. For me, a pathway for progression includes certain monetary increments. How can we start talking about that? Right. And so we're Mom's hearing that I want to stay, that I feel grateful, that I want to continue. And I'd like to try to revisit how we think about that.
Yeah, and thinking about now that bottom layer of trust and emotion, one of the things that definitely impacts the way that the accuracy at which we hear one another is trust. And like the higher the trust, the more likely we are to do things like give each other the benefit of the doubt and to ascribe positive intent to things that people are saying, or what is called negative sentiment override, where we assume that everything that someone else is doing has a nefarious intent. And that becomes symptomatic of low trust. Natalie, how does that like correlate with that emotional bar as well?
The emotions go two ways. The emotions go with your ability to deal with the other heightened emotion. We talked about why these conversations feel difficult earlier. And so you first want to self-regulate, but you also have to know that if you ask for a pay rise and someone says you haven't earned it yet, that's one of the options, that you don't want to take that hook. You don't want to take that bait either. So the more that you can stay centered, the more likely they're going to stay centered. This is a terrible analogy, but it's true. We don't kick puppies. We might kick dogs that are snarling at us, although no one should be kicking anything. But if he snarls, we feel justified in kicking him. But when you kick a puppy and it lays down, you're a jerk. And so when you can take in what they say, be prepared for that emotional feedback and don't take the bait, you're the puppy they don't want to kick anymore. Right. And so it's both regulating yourself, but it's also not taking that emotional bait so that we're not complicating the situation and not making it more challenging. So even if, and this daughter and mother actually do trust each other, which is the funny thing, but it was something they feel uncomfortable around, which is money. And most people do. That the mother heard and the daughter said in some way, she didn't know she was saying it, but that's how it was interpreted. And I could absolutely see how the mother took it that way. She heard, you don't know my worth. You are not treating me fairly. And so even though they had trust because she felt elevated, it was a low trust moment in their relationship. It wasn't that they don't always trust each other. So emotionally regulating can support that trust or erode that trust. You don't need both in equal measure in that moment.
So having that self-awareness as a foundation to building that self-regulation, which supports then healthier dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And understanding. Yeah, and then thinking about the tools on this. So if we're trying to come up with the practical ways to make sure this is happening in the best way possible, I know that in my practice, a lot of times I talk about four facets of active listening and being attending, paying attention, demonstrating that you are engaged in what someone's saying. I also like to encourage people to think about attending as looking to see if there is congruence between what a person is saying and how they're saying it and how they are physically showing up, so that you can see, like, they may be agreeing with you, but their body's telling a different story.
Yeah.
There's another facet of this, which is inquiry, which is where people are talking to you about something that's going on for them. And you take the position of sort of the independent observer, and you are seeking to understand rather than to be understood. And you're trying to get their whole story by asking questions and getting them to dig deeper into what they're sharing with you. And then there's the third one is paraphrasing. I know that there are times where paraphrasing is an appropriate thing, but there's also times where I think trying to be parroting, like reciting what a person specifically said, can also be more critical. And for me, I tend to emphasize that one when it's something that's technical or very specific and more succinct. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that when you're deciding whether or not you're paraphrasing or saying verbatim what somebody just shared. And
Parroting for
what?
two reasons. The very first one is we love to correct other people. So I tell you, Donnel, I've had the worst day I've ever had. And you repeat back to me, I've had the worst day I've ever had. And because I want to think you're wrong about that, I was like, I didn't say that. I said I've had the worst day I've had all week. And instead of you correcting me, you say, okay, you've had the worst day you've had all week. Okay, why is that important? Or what about that is important? I get to edit myself with you. So I get to hear my errors as if I'm the person speaking and you're parroting. The other piece is you, if we're in a perceived conflict, when you say it out loud, your brain hears it as truth too. You're able to try on my side of that discourse more effectively. And so it really is more effective for both parties when you're especially having some tense relationships. Later, if we need to talk about something as an aggregate in summary, we can paraphrase, but you really need to earn paraphrasing trust.
Okay, so when you're in it and you're seeking clarity, the parroting can be more effective. So I'm curious if that's what I'm hearing you say. Is that accurate? But I'm
That's correct.
paraphrasing there. So what I'm wondering is then paraphrasing matched with the fourth part of active listening, which is checking for accuracy. Does that elevate it to the same level as parroting?
Yes, towards the end. So you and I go through this thing, not about our bad day, but our disagreement on something. And you let me say all the things I have to say. You double check that I get that. Is it right? You do that over and over again. You pair it till we're there. Then when you say, okay, Natalie, what I heard is da 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 da. Now we need to do X about it. That's where the paraphrasing says I've followed, I've tracked, and you don't want to recap. You can't recap like a 10-minute conversation word for word, right? So
Okay.
that's where it goes with that fourth piece. Absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah. And going into that fourth piece is that it's actually a bigger concept than just how it connects to paraphrasing. So there's one part of checking for accuracy that fits with paraphrasing where you're going, did I hear that correctly? But then checking for accuracy can also be, or checking for understanding and accuracy can be asking questions like, did I get all of it? Or do you have other concerns? It can be at the end of a family meeting saying, what did everyone hear as the decisions that were made today? So that people are leaving with the same information. I tend to tell family business clients that if you find yourself leaving from any important business meeting or family meeting and you're having to fill in the blanks for things that you weren't clear about, that's a good indication that you need to go back and make sure you're on the same page as everybody else.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the things you can do as well, if people aren't as good with that 4-part model yet, is you do the work. This happened to me. I won't pick on a client story. This happened to me in a meeting. We were working with a client and we were doing a CEO search. And there are these pretty stuck in their way guys. I love them, old school, 150-year-old family business. And something happened in the meeting, but everyone was really upset. And so I just said, what did you hear me say? What mistake did I make? And they were like, we heard you say we'll never have another family CEO. And I was like, oh gosh, if I said that, I'm really sorry. What I meant to say was, even if you have a family CEO, we should use the same criteria if you were hiring an outside person. Yes. And one guy in the room was like, I heard that, but the moment you said outside CEO, I couldn't listen anymore, right? So the sender receiver model is great when your family's learned it. But if they haven't, you can help them when you notice there's a difference of how they're interpreting it, of saying, what did I say wrong? Help me understand, where you don't need them. It would be great if they would parrot or paraphrase, but they might not have learned this. So you're checking in when you notice something going on in the room. I was just working with a client last week too, and this happened between a mother and a daughter, where she's like, you don't care about me at all. And the mother was like, oh my gosh, honey, like, what did I say that made you feel that way? And I think that it's very important to prep our sending. It'd be great if our receivers were that communicative. If they're not, we need to help them. We need to help them realize when what we said, what our intention was, doesn't match the impact it's having in the room. So we can kind of coach people into that by being our own receivers as well, saying, ooh, this seems to not match. What did I do wrong? People love telling you when you're wrong. So just start there and they'll do it.
Yeah. And I always go back to, again, no matter who you are, if you are a human being, um, this can be challenging, no matter what your background is. And making sure that there is accuracy in terms of what somebody is sending and what somebody is receiving is a skill to develop. And it also is sometimes something that requires having a third party involved to help mediate the exchange of information and make sure that, the filters around the background of life experience and the person and the experience around the topic are being accurately looked at and interpreted.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Natalie. This was a lot of fun today.
Always.